At this time, I will turn it over to our leader here on the West Coast, our esteemed 12th District Representative, Brother Kwame Dow.
Thank you, Brother Barnes. Appreciate the introduction. As Brother Barnes mentioned, my name is Brother Kwame Dow. I'm the 34th District Representative of what we out here in the West call the massive and progressive 12th District, which includes the 10 states in the West, including Alaska. I'd like to also welcome you to the Bay Area African American Police Chief Town Hall. Let me go ahead and I'm just going to go ahead and put it in the universe and go ahead and claim it already. Congratulations to the Brothers of Theta Pi on an outstanding event this evening. I know it's going to be great. It's certainly timely for what's going on in this country at this point, but timely because we're going to get the opportunity tonight to really cut through some of the noise as it relates to law enforcement in our community. We out here in the 12th District, we're extremely focused on making sure that we create a strong relationship as we possibly can with the law enforcement community. If it's going to work, we have to do it together. So I'm excited about this forum this evening, certainly. I want to also thank all the panelists in advance of their introductions, as well as the brothers behind the scenes that are making all of this happen this evening. And also I want to take a moment to also thank each one of you that took some time out of your day-to-day to participate and attend this critical forum. So sit back, relax, take the information in, and let's put it into good action. At this point, Brother Hutchinson, why don't you go ahead and come on board.
Good evening, fellow Omega Men and guests. I am Julian Pilot Hutchinson, Spring 2018 Initiative Theta Pi chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. It is with great honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished moderators for this evening. For our first moderator, we have the former president of the San Francisco Board of Education and current member of San Francisco's Board of Supervisors, representing District 10. He is also current member of San Francisco's Pi Chi chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity. We have Brother Shaman Walton. Next, we have former Omega Psi Phi Fraternity 12th District Representative and current member of Oakland Sigma Iota chapter. We have Brother James Walker. I will now be passing the discussion over to our moderators for the night.
Thank you so much, Brother Hutchinson. And again, I just want to reiterate the excitement we have for the discussion and panel tonight. And I also just want to say how historic this is for us to be able to have a conversation with leaders in law enforcement, and all of them being Black leaders in law enforcement here in the Bay Area. It is very important that our young people and our folks get to see folks at the very top level of law enforcement when we're having these conversations. And so I want to thank each and every one of our chiefs and deputy chiefs for being on here this evening. We have, first off, our Vallejo Police Chief, Mr. Shawnee Williams, who is here tonight as one of our panelists. We have Oakland Deputy Police Chief, Drennan Lindsay, who is also here this evening with us. Sacramento Police Chief Daniel Hahn, and also Richmond Police Chief Lisa French. And so I just again want to reiterate the excitement about tonight's conversation. I want to thank all of you. Brother Walker and I will be asking questions on different topics. And now I'm going to pass this over to our 32nd District Representative, Brother James Walker.
Fantastic. Good evening, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be here today. Chiefs, thank you all for joining us. As we've mentioned, there are a series of four kind of distinct topical areas that we'll cover for today, and I'm first up. So the first one is around racial profiling, and we're going to jump right into it. There's been quite a bit of data out there that's talked about disparities around racial profiling and what happens. In a recent report, 2018 report by California Police Data, gives kind of some example of that, where they identified that in the city of San Francisco, had reported maybe about 26% of drivers who've been stopped are African Americans, although they represent about 5% of the city's population. This is indicative throughout the state of California and nationally that we see these types of things happen. And so the first question to you all is, in what ways are your departments addressing issues around racial profiling? What are the policies and practices you all are looking to implement or have been implementing? And why don't we start with Chief Williams, and then we'll give everyone a moment to answer that question.
Well, first of all, I'd like to just thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today just to address, some of these issues. And especially when I look around and look at and see how much talent is here. You have senior leadership from around the Bay Area. But let me just address this topic. When it comes to racial profiling, in most departments it is not tolerated. Most of us have a policy that prohibits bias stops or racial profiling. So some of the things that we do, first of all, is who you hire and how you train them. You have to have strong policies and oversight to ensure that that's not happening. In the state, there is something called RIPA, and it's the Racial Identity Profiling Act, where we have to actually collect data. And that's important because you need to understand what's happening so that we can be data driven, so that if there is problems that we can address those. Internally in police departments, in addition to the strong policy and oversight, you have to have active supervision. So you have to have supervisors that are monitoring what's happening in terms of your stop. You need to be able to look at that. And if there are issues, you need to be able to address it. But we also have to understand that there is bias in America, and there is a system of racism that has existed for many years. And so one of the things that we do is that we provide classes, training on implicit bias training, so people can understand their own biases, because we're human beings and inherently there is bias. So if we don't address those, then it's going to be hard to identify it when it's happening. So those are some of the things that we're doing to address it. You do it through training, you do it through accountability, and you do it through active supervision.
Thank you. Deputy Chief Lindsay.
All right, thank you again for having me this evening. And so what Chief Williams have already indicated, that's a lot of the things that we're doing at the Oakland Police Department. So I can just elaborate further on some of the additional things that we've done to address racial profiling. So we've been collecting data for about 15 years. As you all know, we are under a negotiated settlement agreement. And so that was one of the terms of the agreement. And so with the data, we use the data, we analyze the data no different than we would analyze crime. And so we do have bi-monthly risk management meetings where we look at the data to determine any patterns or trends. For example, you may have an officer who has a high amount of stops of African Americans. And so you start to drill down and look at the types of stops that that officer is making to ensure that the stops are in alignment with probable cause, or, they're just not around fishing and looking for people to stop arbitrarily. We also have incorporated procedural justice training, which is good not only to educate the department as a whole, but to also assist with the training and development of our supervisors and commanders, who are also responsible for the oversight of police officers and their behavior as well. So those are just some of the things that we're doing. Additionally, we have a program where we put people, I guess we would call that like a monitoring program. So if we do have people who we have deemed to have issues with just making stops arbitrarily, and although it may not be enough to put a case on them or some type of violation, but just someone that we may want to monitor their behavior, we also have a program in-house as well that monitors that. So.
Thank you. Chief Hahn, and then we'll go to Chief French, and then I have a follow-up question. So.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far. And the problem with racial profiling is it's all about intent. And you can't really dig into somebody's brain to find out what their intent was when they stopped somebody or did something as a police officer. And so for us, it really goes to dealing with biases. And so I often get asked, is there bias in the police department? Absolutely. There's absolutely bias in every police department because there's bias in every segment of our society throughout the entire country. Everybody on this call has bias. So the question is, how do you deal with it? What impact does that have on our community? What impact does that have on the trust level in certain segments of our community? So we do a lot of implicit bias training, but we also teach history to our officers. I teach a history class. Matter of fact, this week I'm teaching one on Zoom to the community. Last one being tomorrow, that talks about how we got to where we're at right now. How did we get to the disparities that we see in our community right now? It's not hard to see that, but we don't get taught that in our schools. So we do training. We've invited, Stanford's doing a study, Washington State is doing a study, Center for Policing Equity is doing a study, American Leadership Forum is doing a study, and teaching classes, history classes, bias classes, and then analyzing the impact of those programs. So those are just a few of the things that we're doing.
Thank you. Chief French.
So I won't reiterate everything everyone else has already said, but I think one of the things that we're doing here, addition to what everybody has said, is that we are contracting with the Center for Policing Equity to specifically look at our data to determine where the disparities occur so that we can get some, an outside voice to help us look at where these disparities are occurring and see how we can fix that. So that's the only thing I have to add.
Thank you. So let me follow up because it came up a couple of times. I think both Chief Hahn and Chief Williams mentioned it, and that's this piece around implicit bias, right? And so, when we talk about that, the intent is that folks have good intentions and maybe aren't just aware of what their biases are, right? And I think we have seen historically through this country, throughout our history in this country, that that's not always the case. Some people are overtly biased as well. And so when you couple that with the systemic structures that are in place, it makes it even more challenging. And so my question is really, the next one is really about, so can you speak and drill down a little bit more about kind of your practices, your thought process about ensuring that this type of behavior does not happen? You talked about analyzing data and kind of trying to distill some of that, but what happens when you actually catch folks in the act? Like, what should citizens feel proud about or know in terms of what will happen when biases are actually identified? And whoever, I'm going to open it up to you.
I'll go first. I think the first step in that is the background process. So, we get a lot of people that apply for police officers that come from all sorts of backgrounds and have all sorts of things in their background packet. So anytime we get any indication that there might be some biases or racial issues in their background, we don't hire them. So that's the very first bare bones basic thing is if you suspect something, it's not worth the chance. And so the other one is if there's any overt like racism, they get fired. But typically it's somebody feels like they were stopped because they were Black or something. And that's very hard to prove one way or the other, because again, it goes back to intent. So you have to look at patterns. You have to look at their history. We have most departments now, I imagine probably all the departments on here now have the ability to do that we've never had before, meaning body cameras, in-car cameras. So typically when we get a complaint about somebody, we'll look back 2 years at all their body cameras to see if there's any other issues, not just on racial profiling, but any issue, to see if there's a pattern, if there was something that happened before. We didn't used to have that ability because we didn't have cameras, but now we videotape just about anything an officer does. So it makes it easier for us to determine the actions of an officer. So there's a lot of ways now with technology that we didn't have before.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to elaborate on it?
I'll say this, that I've said it publicly that I won't tolerate racism. Racism in a police context cannot be tolerated, and anyone that demonstrates explicit racism should be fired. They should be terminated. They don't deserve to wear our patch. I've said this also, no one hates a bad cop more than a good cop. And so we all know that racism, explicit racism, is unconstitutional, and it violates the oath that we are sworn to protect and to serve. So it won't be tolerated in my department and in most departments across the country. It will not be tolerated. And that's why we have explicit policies against it. And I agree with the chief that it starts with who we hire, and we have to vet the people properly to ensure that they are ethical people with good morals that won't practice racial discrimination. So it won't be tolerated. So that's where the accountability piece comes in. We have to hold ourselves accountable, but we also need to be transparent in what we're doing. And that's one of the things we're doing in Vallejo. We're going to have an accountability and transparency page that we can highlight misconduct. It would be aggregated data, and it'll show the status of what those cases are. But we just want to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable to that high standard.
I'll just add that we all have policies against discrimination. So, that's how we hold our officers accountable, is through our policies. And again, like Deputy Chief Lindsay said, it's really up for us. We depend on our first line supervisors to really be monitoring and look at that early warning system. So if we have an officer that we could determine is stopping only African-American females, then that's a problem. If we have an officer that's getting complaints in a certain area, then we need to look over that AVR footage and evaluate what's going on with this officer. So we have things, policies and procedures in place to try to catch those behaviors early on.
Thank you. And so you all have talked about when it's really explicit, right? It's a lot easier. And you've talked about doing training for some of the more implicit biases that might exist. The other question here is just thinking about this concept of color of any law, color of law, right? Where I think sometimes these issues might slip by because someone says, well, I stopped them while I was, doing my job. This was part of my job. And we're still dealing with this issue of bias. How would you respond to citizens around understanding kind of the letter of the law in terms of job and the work that needs to be done and kind of, when these biases come up? And how do you work with your officers in understanding where that line is, or if there is a line? And why don't we go with Deputy Chief Lindsay, and then maybe someone else can respond.
Okay, so yes, implicit bias is really difficult to catch and manage because it's not overt. And I think a lot of the chiefs have already described just looking at patterns and trends in people's behaviors, looking at the body worn camera, and really coming up with some type of plan to, change or develop the officer, in addition to developing the supervisors and the command staff. But one of the things that we found to be very helpful in our department, we've done a lot of work with the Stanford researchers, and that's the structural solutions. And so what those are just creating policies that are meant to mitigate areas ripe for potential bias. And so, for example, one of our crime fighting strategies, we use intelligence-led policing. And so what we try to do is ensure that officers are focused. It's almost like a surgical incision of how we have them focused on crime. And so you really help to guide how they police the community by ensuring that they are focused on those individuals that are wanted for crimes or persons of interest, ensuring that we, work with the ceasefire strategy, and we really just kind of focus on those individuals, that small percentage of individuals that are likely or that are engaged or that have been confirmed to be engaged in crime just crime in general in the city of Oakland. So those types of strategies have been very effective for us. And when we look at our data, and I can also talk about another policy maybe a little bit later on where it did help our department cut our officer involved shootings down dramatically because just of an intervention that we put in place. So I'll just say I'll end with the structural solutions are very helpful in narrowing down how our officers behave and how they address the community.
Thank you. And I know we're probably coming up close to time on this particular topic, but before we go, one of the questions that was posed is, have you all ever been racially profiled? So I'm going to throw it out there. Have you ever been racially profiled? And if so, maybe share a little bit of how you handled that and what other recommendations would you give citizens in order to protect ourselves?
And Brother Walker, we have approached 15 minutes, so this should be the last question before going to the next topic.
Thank you. We'll maybe hear from one Chief. Chief Williams, you look like you're ready to go ahead.
Well, I have a story. I was with my kids, and I think they were 10 and 8 at the time. I was in Disneyland. And, I'm sitting there in Disneyland. I'm 6'6", so I couldn't get on the ride with my kids. So I had to go stand in this one little area and wait for them to get on I think they were going to get on the Peter Pan ride and then get off. So I'm standing there kind of just watching all the other kids and the parents that were standing there with me. And a lady comes up and asked me what I was doing there. And I said, "Oh, ma'am, I'm just waiting for my kids to get off the ride." And I look around, there's a lot of people around me, but I'm the only African-American standing there. And so she says, "Well, where are your kids, sir?" I said, "Well, they're over there in the line." "And where are they? Point them out to me, sir." And I go, "Ma'am, who are you? I'm just waiting for my kids." And she unveils that she's part of their security there. And I said, "Oh, well, I can't get on the ride, ma'am. And I didn't tell her who I was, and I think I was a police lieutenant at the time. And, I said, "I can't get on the ride. I'm too tall." She goes, "Sure you can, sir." And she escorts me all the way over there to stand with my kids to get on the ride with the kids. And I still didn't say anything, but I left that area thinking, out of all the people that she could have spoke to, she came up to me, in the middle of Disneyland. And so, it happens, it happens. It depends on how we don't feel good about it. Afterward, you reflect on it and you go, what was the reason that she did that? I brought this up when we were at the Museum of Tolerance training. All of our commanders had to go to this training. We had to explain a story that you just asked. And I brought that up. And some people looked at that and said, "Well, Shawnee, that really wasn't racial profiling. It was more, you're 6'6" and you were just out of place." And they didn't really get it. But, and then some people got it, but that was an experience, and it happens. That's not the only experience I've had, but that's one of the ones I remember because I was with my kids at the time.
Well, I was waiting for you to say you flashed and show them who you were, but I think as maybe we come back to this later on, love just to kind of understand strategies. It happens to all of us, and we're infuriated when it happens. We feel violated and want to respond, and that often leads to escalation. And so strategies about how to manage that outside of woosah would be great. I'm going to turn it over to Shaman, who's going to lead us through the next set of questions.
Thank you, Brother Walker, and appreciate the responses on the first round of questions. We all know ever since, and quite frankly, a little before the killing of George Floyd at the hands, or I should say at the knees, of a police officer, folks have been talking about this concept of defunding the police. Right here in San Francisco, Mayor Breed and I introduced a plan to redirect resources from SFPD and reinvest them in the Black community. And what we did this past budget process, we redirected $120 million over the next 2 years from SFPD's budget and are providing resources for strategies to address some of the social negative impacts that exist for us here in San Francisco. But there are a lot of different definitions of what defunding the police is, what that looks like, what it should look like. So the first question we have is, when you hear defund the police, how do you interpret it? And do you feel that concept is an attack on law enforcement or really a request for improvement? And I think we'll start off with Chief French and then go over to Deputy Chief Lindsay.
All right. So of course we've heard this we've talked about this topic a lot in the last few months. And so when I hear the topic of defund the police, no, I don't think it's an attack on police departments. I think it's the community asking for government to do things differently. And more specifically, I think it's asking for us to focus more on services, not the police department, but government as a whole, to focus more on community services, which have been lacking. And because those services have been lacking, like drug treatment and mental health and homelessness, and all those services have been defunded over time, not because the money's coming to the police department, but because there hasn't been funding. But what that's done is it's left us to hold everything. And so people are going into crisis at higher rates. They're not getting the treatment that they need for their mental health. So we end up having to deal with them because they're in crisis. And now, they have a weapon and they're acting out. Same thing with drug treatment. These drug treatments have been defunded over time. And even with Prop 47 and 57, we're not arresting people for low-level drug offenses, which I don't think is the answer. But what you did was, you put these props into place, and before these folks would go to jail, which again, I don't think is the place for them, but you took these, resources, I'll say, loosely, resources away and didn't replace them with anything. So now you have people that are, on drugs, and we, go issue them a citation if they're smoking crack in the park, and we're not giving them the services that they need to get out of the situation that they're in. So I don't take it as, a hit on law enforcement to defund the police, because I think that what they're really talking about is funding services. Now, what I do have an issue with is that law enforcement should be the ones where the money is taken to fund these services. Specifically here in Richmond, we had a $27 million deficit in this last budget cycle. So we were defunded, but the money wasn't going to fund these services that the community is asking for. The money is actually going to fix our budget problems here in Richmond. So we're already cut to the bare minimum. I have less officers than I've had probably in my entire career to work with, and we don't have enough resources here within our department to do the job that we've been asked to do over the years. And so, I'm looking at ways to partner with our community and maybe come up with, granting opportunities and still partnering with the community to fund some of these services. But that's what we're looking at here in Richmond.
Well, I think Chief French has said a lot of things that I agree with. For me, I believe that defunding is, I don't think of it as a bad thing or a negative or a hit on law enforcement. I think it is a request for change, for improvement, and as an opportunity for a voice of our community to have a say in how they would like to have their communities policed. The reallocation of the money to programs that can address violence and the root causes of violence and crime is very important. I'd like to just maybe offer a story, because as a lifelong educator and then also as a police officer, I do see a need for some change. And I remembered when I was working as a robbery investigator, it was a young man that had been arrested. He was 18 years old. And as I got to talk to him, I found out that he grew up in foster care. At 18, he aged out. He had no family. He was living out of a car, and he committed a robbery because he needed to make a phone call. And so he snatched someone's cell phone so he can make a phone call because he's trying to get a job. And when you think about how a robbery is considered a Part 1 crime, right, a strikable offense, and then you see this young man's situation, he wasn't a bad person, but he was in a bad situation. And so when you think about the opportunity to reimagine policing, reallocate funds to maybe help those who are at risk or find themselves in vulnerable situations where they are likely to commit crimes or do things that they probably wouldn't normally do because they're trying to survive. I think it is an opportunity to look at crime reduction or crime fighting strategies in a different way outside of just enforcement. So I think it is an opportunity for us to kind of relook at things and maybe reintroduce some opportunities and some programs that can really help people not find themselves in these situations, and at the same time reduce crimes in our communities.
Thank you, Chief Williams. Since you're off mute, and then we'll go to Chief Hahn.
Yes, so I would say when you talk about, when I've heard the expression defund, you know, and I look at specifically Vallejo was essentially defunded in 2008. It went from 156 officers down to almost 80 officers. And that was because of bankruptcy. And it had a negative effect on crime, on victims of crime in the city of Vallejo. This year, we've had 26 murders in our city, 26, over 267 shootings in our city. And we're not a large city. And so when I think about defunding, I think that means less officers, that means less resources in our community. It means a less safer community. And so I think for us, we need a well-funded police department, not a defunded police department. I understand the philosophy behind defunding, and I believe that we should provide better services, mental health services in our community. We need to provide better youth support in our community. We need to provide training. But if we're going to look at what's happening, especially in communities that are adversely impacted by crime, we need to look at it holistically. We need to understand that there is a lack of employment, a lack of education, a lack of housing. We need better healthcare. We need to look at the entire system. Sometimes when we're looking at defunding, we're only looking at one part of a systemic problem. And we need to be able to address that systemic issue if we're going to drop crime. And so defunding for us would mean less police services, which means less safety for our community. And we recognize our community needs the police and the police need the community. So we need to be able to work together and talk about being well-funded, being fiscally responsible so that we can deliver services to our victims. And at the end of the day, for me, that's what it's about. It's not about the statistics, because behind those statistics, there are mothers that have lost their sons. There are sons that have lost their fathers. There are serious victims. You know, we had a 12-year-old who saw her mom and her 14-year-old sister shot to death. And she came outside and confronted, this year, and confronted that suspect. That's what we need to be talking about when we're talking about funding. How do we provide better services to people like her that have to live with that trauma for the rest of their life?
Chief Hahn?
Yeah, well, at least here in Sacramento, defunding, I don't know the definition of defunding because I hear all sorts of different opinions on what defunding is, anywhere from completely eliminating the police department to basically an arbitrary 50% cut to the police department. And my response to that, to the reporters and things that ask me, is that if defunding means reduction in officers, reduction in professional staff, our community is less safe. And more specifically, the communities we're trying to help, like the community I grew up in, are definitely less safe. And the reason for that is, well, let me first say, I'm open to anything. I'm willing to look at and examine anything. But I know right now, if all we do is defund and we're not replacing it with anything, and we haven't studied what is going to replace it, our community is going to be less safe. Because the communities that we're talking about are the ones that utilize our services the most. Because the affluent communities, they have insurance, they access other things because where they live and who they know and all those sort of things. Our community, the answer for most things is 911. So as you know, our department is about 100 officers less now than 10 years ago when I was a captain. And our city is about 30 or 40,000 more people. We have a new arena, more festivals, and all those sort of things. So our busiest sectors, our busiest areas are the communities that we're talking about. And because when you eliminate mental health services and other services through bad budget times, bad economies, the fallback is always the police department. And so I do think, though, that we can examine ways to better handle things. For example, I mean, there's a lot of things that if you really look at it is wrong with the way we handle things now, not just police department, but as a society. For example, any of the departments that are represented here, when our officers graduate from the academy, so after they get done with their primary training, they are authorized to put somebody on a mental health hold for 72 hours. There are some of the very few people that are authorized to put somebody on a mental health hold. We hired a full-blown social worker, master's level social worker in the police department when I was sworn in after I was sworn in a couple of years ago. She teaches social work. She teaches our department mental health. She's the one that teaches the academy and the ongoing training to officers about mental health, crisis training, and all that. She can't put a hold on anybody. We get calls to mental health providers, to the clinicians, to the mental health workers that are counseling people with mental health issues. They call us to put mental health holds. They call a 21-year-old police officer to put a mental health hold from the mental health worker, because counties are responsible for who they designate can put mental health holds, and they don't. So if you needed mental health help and you were in a point where you needed a hold put on you because you were a danger to yourself, let's say there was no violence or anything, there was no threat of violence, you still have to call a police officer. Things like that don't make any sense. And those are some of the things that we need to change, or we're going to keep going down this road.
Thank you so much. And I know and understand some of the constraints. I actually had a pretty, I won't say contentious, because we got mad love for each other conversation with Chief Scott earlier today, because he was asking me, how do I expect certain provisions of our safety plan for my district here in San Francisco to be achieved when also reducing the police department budget. But my response to Chief Scott was, here's the reality. We are at a day and age and a time period where, regardless if we all get on the same page or not, law enforcement is probably going to have to be more innovative about how they get things done, particularly probably with less resources, because lawmakers like myself, and not only here in San Francisco, but other municipalities in the Bay Area, are going to reduce budgets. And so this is just one question real quick for whoever wants to answer, because I know we're at time. But with the reduced budget, knowing you have to be innovative, and you brought up things like mental illness training and issues that exist, how do you figure you'll be able to be innovative and still be able to meet the needs of the community in terms of policing without jeopardizing safety, knowing that budgets are probably going to be reduced?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. Well, for us, there's always room for more innovation, and we created a research and development department that's all their job is to research training, research equipment, research whatever to meet the needs of our community. We have a mental health team that they have like a caseload of chronic mentally ill people in our community and respond to mentally ill calls. We have an impact team that works solely with the homeless population and with the homeless service providers. And we use new equipment, whether they're drones or other things, to more safer deal with situations that our officers are called to. But the reality is this. I agree with you 100% that we need to be innovative and be open. And we are such a traditional profession that sometimes that's a struggle. And it's a struggle to pull our people along with it. It is. But I think we have in many departments leaders like are in here today that are willing to take on that struggle and willing to take on that heat. But the reality is cities have danger in them. There are dangerous people in our community that commit crimes. And if we don't have the officers to respond to that, our cities will be less safe. It's just the way it is. And I think what we've seen throughout time is the pendulum never stops, like basically in the middle where it really should stop, like the sweet spot. The pendulum swings from one extreme to the other. So the pendulum swings to whether it's reduce budgets or let everybody out of jail or prison without a real reentry plan or things like that. And then crime starts going up and skyrocketing like in the late 80s. Then the pendulum swings all the way over to the other side. Let's add cops, zero tolerance, 3 strikes, all these things that happened in the late 80s. And then crime goes way down like it has over the last several decades. Right. Then all the way back over to the other side. Never to stop in the middle where it goes, let's blur the lines between these silos. Let's start collaborating. Let's get mental health people and social workers in the department. Let's get the department out in the community. But it doesn't seem to happen like that because we just go from crisis to crisis instead of well thought out plans.
Well, thank you so much, Chief. And I will pass this back to Brother Walker for the next segment. But I will say something that you said, Chief Hahn, I do agree with in terms of pendulum shifts and sometimes going overboard in terms of how we address the issues. But you're 100% right. Crime has gone down, particularly in the state of California, particularly in the Bay Area over the last several decades. And so I think that that says something about what we can do to move forward without over policing and over criminalizing our communities. And I'll pass it over back to Brother Walker. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Walton. Chief Hahn, I want to build on what you were just talking about. And though we're going to talk about use of force in this next segment, but before really jumping into that, I want to tie back to, as you were saying, kind of some of the things that need to happen. And so when I hear this, I think about culture, and I know it's been brought up earlier in our discussion. So what is the police culture? And I happen to be doing some research and preparing for this evening, and ran across an article or something from the Department of Justice here in California, but talked about culture. The culture of a police department reflects what the department believes in as an organization. These beliefs are reflected in the department's recruitment and selection practices, its operational policies and procedures, its training and development, its reward systems, and ultimately the actions of its officers in delivering of services. So when we talk about that, and you're talking about what the shifts that need to happen, how do you pull people along? The question for you all is, how have you, what are the steps that you're taking or plan to take in your role to ensure that you are able to shift police culture to one that's more community oriented versus what you've said kind of been stagnated, Chief Hahn? And that's to the whole group. But what are some of the things that need to happen to move and change the police culture at this point?
Yeah, I'll go first. I agree with that completely. And every department has their own unique culture. Whether they're small departments, large departments, they vary from wherever they're at. But you have to take distinct action to start to shift your culture, and it doesn't happen overnight. And just imagine you have to hire, well-adjusted, humble people that have a heart for service. Because if you think about how much power a police officer has, if you're not a well-adjusted person and you get that much power, and you get into a culture that, with veteran officers that have had that power for a long time, that can take you down some bad roads. And so and if you're going to change a culture in a police department, expect there to be resistance. If you're going to change a culture in any organization, expect there to be some resistance. And you have to, as a leader, you have to be willing to take that resistance on. There's not only going to be resistance from the community, from the police officers in the department, but there's going to be resistance from the community. I'll take these last protests that we had in our city. I chose not to rush officers into dangerous situations under relatively minor crime, broken windows and graffiti. And the sheriff took me on that. He held a whole press conference to say how bad a plan that was. And who do you think got attacked? Him or me? Me. So, you know, when you're trying to change something, even sometimes the community and the media and things want what apparently is the old way instead of the new way. So, I mean, it's heavy involved in what do you reward, because everybody sees what you reward. So the other officers see what you reward and they start learning, okay, that's what this department values. It has everything to do with how you hold people accountable. Well, that's what you don't value. But the other thing are even, I guess you could call, relatively minor things. So we have a whole process to get promoted. Every department does. They typically require at the sergeant level written tests, oral panels. So on our test for every rank now, I assign books like Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And that comes with some resistance because, and what I say to people when they go, that doesn't have anything to do with law enforcement. Well, if you think the issue of race and differences is what ails our country, which I do, then that has everything to do with law enforcement. And so I ask them, when would you ever read that book if it wasn't assigned for a promotion exam? Well, the answer is always, I wouldn't. I never even heard of it. Well, and I'm not asking you to agree with everything in that book. I'm telling you, if you want to promote, you're going to read that book, and it's part of the test. And it's to expand your experiences and understand what some people that you serve might be thinking. And so some of it is even little stuff like that.
Thank you. Chief French.
Chief Hahn is exactly right. It's what we focus on as leaders of our departments and what we reward. And back a couple of chiefs ago, we rewarded a lot of community engagement. So when people see that, that's what we're going to be rewarding. That's who's going to get promoted, the people that are truly engaged. And I'm talking about like really engaged, not just the, you know, go hang out, you know, with a bunch of officers at an event. No, getting involved and sharing your phone number and having those contacts with our community. When we reward stuff like that, that's how we change the culture in our organization. And law enforcement has a culture. There's those law enforcement culture, and that's what draws some people to law enforcement. But when we get them into our departments, we really have to focus on what the culture of our department is, and that incorporates what our community, who our community is. So we're doing a lot of cultural competency training here in our department, where we're making officers spend time with the community before we allow them to go out on patrol. And we're hiring them, putting them out in the community so that they're really ingrained and they have that cultural competency, even if they're not from this particular area.
Thank you. I'm going to put this over to Deputy Chief Lindsay, given you're in the process of, we already spoke it into the universe to become the next chief of Oakland. But what is your perspective on it? And then Chief Williams, we have another question for you. So get ready.
Okay.
Well, first and foremost, I have to applaud you, Chief Hahn, for, you know, integrating different books in your promotional process. We've done some similar things here in our department. We introduced a critical race theory in one of our promotional processes. And that was just one of the beginnings of changing the culture and introducing some new things and ideas for people that we're looking to promote within our organization. And then additionally, in our academies, I led our academies before, and I still assist from time to time with just some of the decision making. But we have moved to some different models in our police academy and in our field training program, because we found that a lot of our culture is shaped when they get into field training. You know, the people that you select as trainers have a huge impact on changing this wonderful, sweet person that came through as a police recruit, right? And then now, you know, about a year later, they're disgruntled. And you're like, how is that happening? And so we started to take a closer look at the people who we were allowing to train our new officers. And we have changed it to a new model. It's more of a mentorship model. It's more based on, I have if I'm a field training officer, I'm vested in seeing you succeed. I'm seeing you win. And we moved away from that hazing type of environment where people feel compelled to emulate this person who is in charge of their training and subsequently sometime their career. Because if they write up a bad rating or review, and make a recommendation for your removal, a lot of times we were finding people were being terminated just for something as a personality conflict, or this person doesn't fit. And there was no real issue why that person couldn't pass the program and join this police department. So those are just some of the things that I support, I have led, I have been a part of, and I will continue to support. I love innovation, so we have to keep doing those things. Thank you.
Sold. We're sold. So Chief Williams, I mentioned we were going to come back to you, right?
Yes.
And I said this section was on use of force. So I want to start there, really, and ask you, what is your position on the use of force? When and to what extent do you deem it to be appropriate?
I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
I said, when and to what extent do you deem it to be appropriate? I'm sorry, I was trying to go into my dramatic voice there. You probably missed that piece of it. But yes, when and to what extent do you deem it appropriate?
Well, let me just first start by saying that we are police officers, we're peace officers, and there's going to be situations where we have to use force to compel compliance. Obviously, our best tool is our mouth, is being able to speak to people to get their willing obedience and cooperation. And that's what we want. One of the things that I did when I came to Vallejo was that we contracted with the Police Force Analysis Strategies Unit. And we're one of the few in the Bay Area that actually have taken a comprehensive look at the data on how often we use force. So we went back and we gave the Police Strategies Unit 3 years of all of our force data. And so I'm now able to see exactly how officers internally inside the Vallejo Police Department, how we're deploying, utilizing force, on who we're utilizing force, how often that's happening. So it's a very robust, comprehensive system. And that information is now public. So one of the things that we do know is that when force is often used when we're making an arrest, and about 4 to 6% of the people that we contact will not comply with officers' direction. And so it's important to understand that 96% of the people that we contact will actually comply. They'll do what the officers ask them to do. So now we're talking about a small segment that don't. And then when we look at the totality of stops that officers make, force is really minimal. And so, which tells me that the majority of officers are doing what we expect them to do. So what we need to understand is how it's being deployed, if it's being deployed properly, and then we need to be able to supervise when force happens. So in our city, anytime force is used, a supervisor has to do a review, and that has to go up the chain of command so that we can ensure people are in policy in terms of how, or outside of policy, but we need to understand how it's being utilized. So there's a standard for how force is used. It needs to be reasonable. It needs to be necessary. If it's unnecessary and unreasonable, then there's accountability. But it needs to be used appropriately, and we need to treat everyone that we're dealing with respect.
So I want to stay on that for just another brief moment. You mentioned about 4% actually resist arrest within your jurisdiction. I'm just curious, when you look at that percentage, have you seen in the data of that 4%, what's the percentage of complaints that have said the force has been excessive, or in your analysis of data that you've seen it to say, whoa, we may have done too much there, even though within that small segment?
So that would be a different question. So it's 4 to 6% in the city of Vallejo. I'm just saying overall, but when you talk about a complaint of force, that's different. That would go to the professional standards unit, and that's something that we would have to look at in terms of who complained when force was used. And then a misconduct complaint would be investigated to either prove or disprove whatever the allegation is. And so that's a little different than actually looking at the force that's been used. So that system that I spoke to you about would only comprehensively look at the force cases that were reported, that have been investigated.
So and I'd love maybe someone else to speak to that, but I think this is when we start to peel back the onion here, that's a very interesting layer, right? That you look at, how much force is used or when it's used on a population, but, when it comes to being excessive, it may be analyzed someplace differently. And most critically, you said it has to be proved, right? And so that's really difficult to prove. That it's been excessive, unless you're someone like a George Floyd. But so how as chiefs, how do you handle that and kind of juggle those things when you have that going on in your various jurisdictions? And I know we're going to be coming up close on time, so we'll go here. Maybe one person can respond, and then one last question after this.
So I'll say we evaluate every single use of force that happens. So it goes through a series of scrutiny from the first line supervisor to the lieutenant to the captain. And then after all of those levels of scrutiny, it also once a month, all of our managers sit in a room and watch the AVR footage and evaluate every single use of force that we had over that past month. And so they're looking to evaluate, are there policy violations? Are there training issues? Are there, what could we have done to make this better? Is there anything that we could have done, first of all? And if so, that's a training issue. Or if there's a policy violation, then that investigation then goes to our Office of Professional Accountability for investigation. And that's how we hold the officers accountable for that excessive use of force. So there's a couple different levels, but I forgot my other point, so I'll turn it over to someone else.
Brother Walker, we're at 15 minutes.
All right, so I'll go ahead and pause there. Thank you so much for your responses here. I'll turn it back over to Brother Walden.
Thank you, Brother Walker. And Chiefs, I'm going to try to do, because we've got a little bit of time, we've got about 10 minutes to get through this segment so we can, of course, allow the audience who has burning questions and also want to get an opportunity to get their questions in. But this topic is the Police Bill of Rights. And this topic is great and interesting for me because as a lawmaker, this is one of the things where, particularly as a local lawmaker, I have absolutely no control over. Deputy Chief Lindsay, you missed the part where we talked about trying to stay on time and answering questions in a certain time period earlier. And so I got two questions for you all. And I know we got just about 10 minutes. So as we go through these questions, if you all could be helpful as the top law officials in your cities, help us stay on time so we can get the audience in. But the first question is, at least 13 states have instituted Police Officer Bill of Rights, which grants officers protections more expansive than what is guaranteed in our Constitution for ordinary citizens. What changes should be made to address this issue in your opinion? And I started with the women last time, so let's start with Chief Williams and then Chief Hahn.
So the question is, what changes do we believe
should be made to address the issue of the Police Bill of Rights, or do you even think there should be one?
Well, I would say, first of all, it comes down to being fair and just in terms of how police officers are treated. Everyone deserves due process. And I believe it would be unfair and unjust for us to prejudge a matter before we know all the facts. And so when an allegation comes in, we need to be fair, thorough, and objective when we're looking at what's happening with that individual case and officer. So the Police Officer Bill of Rights in the state of California determine when we can do the interview, what rights the officer has to review, the allegations and different things that provide those officer protections. And I believe that that's fair, and that's necessary to ensure that the officer is treated properly. But we also have to understand the community concerns to have whatever the matter is adjudicated properly as well, because there needs to be accountability, transparency, and justice for the community concerns. So we need to be able to balance both. And I think that that's important in terms of justice for officers and the community. So we need to be cognizant of that. But we also need to be able to hold people accountable when there are, things that we know as chiefs that need to be addressed. And I don't personally believe that the Police Officer Bill of Rights was designed to protect someone that is committing misconduct. And
Thank
so,
you, Chief. And I'm gonna stop you there and allow some space for Chief Hahn.
Yeah, let me start by saying one of the things I hear a lot, and I imagine all the chiefs on here have, is that the unions prevent me from doing certain things, or the unions prevent the management of police departments from holding people accountable, imposing discipline. At least here in Sacramento, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The union here has not prevented me from doing anything. Now, do they fight for their members? Absolutely, but the facts are still the facts. They have certain rights to have lawyers and all that, but you still have to go through the process. The facts are still the facts. So there's never been a case where I've wanted to discipline somebody where I didn't because the union told me not to or took some sort of action. Never, not one time in my entire career has that happened. So I think the Bill of Rights, there are some things that I think are, I guess you could term them good or neither good nor bad. They just spell out a process and they give certain rights to an employee, but the facts are still the facts. And so Bisa and I and several other chiefs went on Juneteenth last year to the Capitol, and we talked about some changes that to the Bill of Rights. I don't necessarily think the Bill of Rights should be thrown out, but I do think there are some changes that have over time, I don't know that this was done on purpose, but over time have hurt us. So for example, releasing information on officers that were disciplined. I do think that should change. If we fire somebody, I think we should be able to release their file. Right now with 1421, we release certain things, but they're only under 3 categories. I would say anytime somebody gets fired, because it's not easy to fire a police officer. So if they get fired, they've already gone through their appeals process and all these other things. And so I think that would help with the belief and trust in the community, because right now you can basically say, yes, we found that person did what you accused them of, but we can't really tell you what was done. So
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Chief. And I appreciate you elaborating on that, because the fact that you mentioned not being able to share certain information of officers who've been fired, the DA and I introduced a resolution here urging our Civil Service Commission to make sure we never hire anyone from any other municipality, any officers in any law enforcement body here in the city that may have excessive force allegations, misconduct, or who may have been fired. But in a lot of cases, you don't know because you can't share certain information. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I do just want to say, it may not be the same in Sacramento, but anytime I get a chance to publicly state that we have a racist police officers association in San Francisco, I want to make sure that I publicly state that. We do. Their actions, the things they've done, the things they've said, some of the publications that they put out are racist and are arbitrary to us being able to move forward in terms of how we work together in law enforcement. Of course, that's not the issue of anybody on here, but I just have to always publicly state that.
Can I add one thing?
Of course.
On the issue of if somebody did something in their old department, any department that's hiring a police officer from another police department, regardless of where it's from, California, outside California, that does not know the background of that officer, that's their own fault. Never hire somebody that they don't know that background. So there is a belief that people that get fired just shop around to other departments. If that happens, blame the department that hired them, because we have every right to look at their entire background, their internal affairs file, their personnel file. And if they don't sign the paper that withdraws that right to keep it confidential, they don't go any farther. And most departments are like that. And any department that doesn't do that, you should be really having some concerns about that department.
I appreciate that. That is important to know.
And
Chief
Brother
French
Walker, we're
and
at 3
Deputy
minutes
Chief.
and 40 seconds.
Say that again, Julian.
We're at 3 minutes and 30 seconds left.
Okay, let me do this then for Chief French and Deputy Chief Lindsay. Qualified immunity, it's an issue of major concern. I tried to pick the most fair definition. The one I have, it says, the United States qualified immunity is a legal principle that grants government officials performing discretionary functions immunity from civil suits unless the plaintiff shows that the official violated clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. A lot of the belief, and quite frankly, my belief, that qualified immunity is one of the most major problems of why officers think they are untouchable and above the law. What are your thoughts on qualified immunity, Chief French and Deputy Chief Lindsay? And I think you both got a minute. My apologies.
Well, I mean, there should be some protections. I mean, we're asked to do a job that is a difficult job to do. I think where we run into issues is when we run into issues. So let me go back a second. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'm gonna let Deputy Chief Lindsay go first.
Okay. So yeah, I think the job of policing is very challenging. I think there's a lot of gray areas. The job involves a lot of risk. And I was thinking about that earlier today when I looked at some of the questions, and you know, the thought always comes in my mind about the Constitution and where police officers even fall in terms of like the executive branch within the US Constitution. So it is a challenge. I don't think officers believe that they are untouchable, because I believe, like some of the other chiefs have stated today, if you have policies where you're able to enforce those policies, and you have, you know, I don't see any impediments from our union. Our union is the facts are the facts. Of course, they're going to fight for the rights of the membership. But I really believe that if we have a good platform where we have good policies, we have good investigatory procedures, and we, you know, are following through on the things that we identify that are right, and that we need our officers to stay focused on doing and being, and how we want them to, gosh, I've lost my train of thought now. But overall, if we have a good plan, a good policy as how we want our officers to be governed and how we want them to be accountable, it shouldn't take away from, you know, the qualified immunity and not allowing officers to have certain protections, because again, the job has so much risk to it that it is very difficult to say that we shouldn't give them certain protections, or we shouldn't give them certain due processes as any other person should have. So it is a touchy situation. I can understand both sides of the coin on that. But again, you know, being in policing is not an easy job, and it's not just as black and white as people would think it would be. And so I think Chief French want to get back in there. Hey.
Yeah, my bad. So I think we're actually seeing a change too. We're seeing officers being charged with crimes now where we hadn't in many years. So I think that, you know, the qualified immunity, I don't want to say it's completely going away, but I think that, you know, district attorney's offices are really taking a hard look on the actions of officers, and they're not hesitating as much to charge officers for crimes nowadays. But I also think that, you know, the hiring and retaining of officers, we have to be able to hire great officers, and they have to be comfortable to go out there and do their job. And like Chief Williams said earlier, that involves using force. That's part of our job. That's inevitably going to happen. And so we need to have some protections, but again, we have to have policies and procedures in place to hold our officers accountable. And when they don't follow those procedures and policies, then that opens them up to litigation.
Thank you so much. And now we are at the point where we're going to open it up to some of the questions from folks who have been viewing this forum. I know some sent questions in earlier and some are in the chat now. So I'm going to turn this over to Brother Hutcherson to let us know what questions we're going to yield.
Okay, we have opened up the Q&A section for questions from the audience. So I am going through these to figure out the most appropriate questions. One of the questions that stands out is specifically for Chief Hahn. How do you expect to earn back the trust of Latinos and Blacks in Sacramento after pepper bombing and shooting peaceful protesters with rubber bullets, but showing up to prayer marches the following day to meet with local pastors in Sacramento? Why should we trust you as a man who identifies as a Black man when it's convenient for you, but not when it comes to our issues in our city? For example, with Stephon Clark and Taylor Blackwell. Where were you?
So that's a large question. So I don't identify as Black when it's convenient. I've been Black since the day I was born. I've always identified as Black. It's not convenient or not or is convenient. It just is. And so I'm Black whether I'm in this uniform or out of this uniform. In regards to the prayer or march that they referred to after the initial protest, I think that's probably somebody that doesn't understand what happened. I'm the one that put that together. I'm the one that called the pastors and the community leaders. That was my march. That was in my neighborhood, about 2 blocks from where I grew up at a church that I was at pretty much every day growing up. So, you know, to rebuild the trust in the segments of our community that don't have it isn't something that can, you know, you just snap your finger and you cross your fingers and hope for it to happen. You have to put in some work, and you have to do it for so long that they trust you. And we have in every community across this country a level of distrust in certain segments of the community, like the African American community, the Hispanic community. I know that. I got arrested when I was 16 from an officer. So I grew up in that community. And so my commitment from the day I got sworn in was to work on that. And so we work with youth groups, we work at the community. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're going to continue to work at it.
Hey, Brother Hutcherson, I also see a couple of other questions that are there, and I want to make sure we honor in some of the order that they flow. So this question was from Ms. Moore. And so it asks, what policies are being enacted to make sure that officers are completely vetted and trained for the situations that they are responsible for responding to, such as departments that are specifically geared towards the arresting and responding of mental ill people? And I know you spoke to that maybe to some degree, but you talked about mental health, social workers. What else are you doing to ensure that those are linking up?
You're on mute, Brother Walker.
Why don't we have Chief French go ahead and speak to that?
Your voice kind of lowered at the end, but I'll talk to the mental health specifically. We've been having our officers engaged in crisis intervention training. And again, as I talked before about the defunding, a lot of these issues have fallen on the police to handle. And so we've tried to figure out ways to deal with these where people are not hurt or injured. And so specifically for mental health issues, we've had crisis intervention training for all of our officers for going back for years now. And additionally, we were one of the first departments to start talking about de-escalation training. And this was years ago too. I know it's a hot topic now, but I remember when our chief first introduced it, and I had people from other departments across the nation calling me saying, what is your chief talking about, this de-escalation? You're gonna get officers killed. And now obviously it's a across the board kind of what we're expected to do. So, you know, making sure that we're training our officers to be able to respond to the situations that we're expected to respond to, and giving them the tools and resources to be successful in those responses.
Thank you. And you all, based on what Brother Walton mentioned earlier, we are going to treat this like speed dating at this point. There are quite a few questions, so we'll just kind of go around, but ask you to continue to be succinct. We appreciate your patience with us this evening and answering all the questions, no matter how difficult. The next one is from Brother Kumba, and his question is, how can we as citizens exercise our constitutional rights when stopped by police? Chief Williams, talk to us.
Well, I think it's really important when you're stopped by the police to expect two things: that officer is going to listen to you, they're going to understand or explain the reason for that stop. But it's also important to have mutual respect on both sides, for the citizen to understand that you may not know why the officer is stopping you, but you are required by law to just follow those orders. If it's a vehicle stop, produce your license, give your registration, and you can, it's okay to ask the officer, why did he stop you? Or she stop you, and be able to explain that. But I think it's important just to understand that on both sides, there's certain things that you need to do during those stops. And then if there's something that, you believe that was not right, or you were stopped inappropriately, then, there's a way that you can deal with that through the internal affairs process, or a way that you can complain about that. And we will look at that as a police department. But I think when you talk about constitutional rights, you have a right, you have Fourth Amendment rights, and we all do. But you should understand that during that contact, there are certain things that we all need to do. The officer has a job to do, and you also, as a citizen, just need to comply with the lawful orders of that officer at that time. What we don't want is a use of force situation.
Thank you, Chief Williams. The next question, though, directed towards you, and I'm going to ask this in general because I live in Oakland, and Deputy Chief Lindsay is an issue here as well. And this is about responsiveness. So when there is something that happens, what are you all doing to address the lack of or slow response time to police officers responding? I know you talked about, hey, we're short-staffed, but when crisis is happening, it's happening. So what could you share with us maybe to talk about how to either get our responses heard faster, get quicker responses? What should we be thinking about?
So for 911 calls for service, we have been challenged this year with just the lack of resources. We've been trying to hire and recruit more dispatchers, trying to, triage the calls, and trying to get our officers to respond as quickly as possible. So we continue to try to do our best and try to respond to calls for emergencies as quickly as possible. But we all have bosses. And so I would always say, if you are not getting the type of service that you feel that you need, or you're not getting a quick response, you should email or call or get in touch with the chief or any of the area commanders. We do have an area command system. And so that motto is that each captain for the 5 designated areas are responsible for the delivery of services. They also have special resource teams that have the community resource officers that should be in constant communication with people on their beat. We have the neighborhood services coordinators who should be also facilitating a different way of communicating with your community resource officers. So there's a different variety of ways to get response and to get services from the police department. But I think we just have to continue to be more transparent, use different social media platforms and the news platforms to push out information and make sure that we're making ourselves available, making sure that the numbers that you need to get into contact with us, or even if it's just, sharing the information for the criminal investigation division, or vehicle abatement, making sure that we have that information available and push it out there. So we'll do a better job. I'll make sure.
I'm gonna hold you to that. I'm gonna hold you to that. We have one other here, which was anonymous, but I think it's really important as young people who are struggling with racial profiling. What advice would you have for them? And let's go to Chief Hahn.
Yeah, I think the first thing, if there's a specific incident that happened that they have that concern about, they need to call. And they need to talk to a supervisor or an area captain. And again, we have resources now that we've never had before, body cameras, GPS on the cars. So there's a lot of ways to look into complaints that used to be just maybe a he said, she said, but now you can actually watch what happened as that person's supervisor or lieutenant. So I would say that's the very first thing. In the long run, I think people that should explore either a career in law enforcement so they can be that officer out in the community. But we also have programs where we take students out to our academy, and that program was really developed by students. And so we've taken like 250, it's kind of stopped during COVID, but they go through a whole program out at the academy where they go through the simulation machine, they do traffic stops, they experience some of the training as best we can as the officers do. So that'd be one way that they can get a view and make comments and look. But again, any specific incident, they need to call a supervisor so somebody can look into that.
Thank
And
you.
real quick, Chief Hahn, along those lines, and I have a question because as we started off this, I stated my excitement for being able to have a conversation with law enforcement officials at the top level that look like me. And I think we have a responsibility to ask this question. But how are you preparing African-American law enforcement officers to assume executive roles in their agencies or other agencies throughout the state? And I just heard Chief Hahn touch on that, but I would love to hear on what you all are doing to help other folks that look like us excel in this career.
Well, I would like to answer that. So I have been a part of the Oakland Black Officers Association for over 20 years, and a part of our just our mission has been the mentorship of other African Americans within our organization. But we always open it up to everyone. But I've been personally doing it since 2002, and I not only help those who are within the Oakland Police Department, but we do partner with Noble and put events together just to help prepare people for the next stage, the next level, and hopefully that they can assume some of these leadership positions within law enforcement. And then also we have a pipeline program here in Oakland. There is a pre-academy program at Merritt College, which is comparable to what you described, Chief Hahn, where college students and even some of the students 16 and older can take this course, and they get an introduction to what law enforcement is all about. They get to do driving, they do defensive tactics. We teach them about law, and we also teach them about how they could be hired as a police officer and how they can get through a background successfully. So I personally love doing the mentorship internally and working with other organizations as well. So.
Thank you so much, Chief Lindsay. Anybody else want to answer that briefly before we pass this back to the Basileus of Theta Pi chapter?
I'll just say, I'm sorry, Chief Williams, were you going to go?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. I always have a saying, as I climb, I lift. So it's my responsibility as I climb the ladder to where I am now to lift others up with me. And so that's through mentoring, just impersonal, just conversations across the board with my staff, specifically the African-American officers. We call ours the guardians of justice. And so meeting with them regularly, preparing them for promotions, and just making sure that they do well through the process.
Chief Williams, you got a quick 30 seconds you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I believe in developing leaders around us is important, but being able to reach out and develop those in our careers by mentoring, by coaching, by just being there to answer the questions. And so I believe that starts from day one. I mean, each one teach one, and that's been the philosophy of law enforcement for a long time. And that's something I personally believe in. I have a close friend of mine that just recently was promoted last week to captain in the city of San Jose, and one of the things here in one of the first books that I require for promotional training is developing leaders around you. And so it's important for us. There can be no success without successors. So we have to continually do that so that we can lift others up.
Thank you so much. And again, it's been a pleasure to be a moderator of this discussion. Obviously, we have so much we can talk about, and hopefully we'll be able to do this all again together. And with that, I will pass this back over to the boss list and the leader of Theta Pi chapter, Brother Keith Barnes.
Thank you, Brother Walton. I'm going to defer first to our great leader for the 12th District, Brother Dow, then I will close out the session.
Thank you, Brother Barnes, because I was going to say I have to jump in here for a quick second. First of all, this forum was absolutely outstanding. I want to thank the chiefs for their participation this evening. You answered every single question, regardless of how tough it was. And I appreciate the honesty because a lot of times, when you're dealing with, and I'm not calling you guys politicians, but when you're dealing with politicians or some people in law enforcement, it's hard to get a straight answer. So I want to commend you all for coming and giving us a straight answer this evening. To the moderators, Brother Walton and Brother Walker, outstanding job. Again, Brother Basilis, thank you very much for putting together this forum this evening. And this is really in line with some of the work that we're doing on the district level with our community oriented police task force. This is absolutely critical. If we are going to, as a country, get to a better place, we have to work together. And part of that working together is working together with law enforcement, as well as the communities that you all serve. So again, thank you so much for participating this evening. The audience as well, thank you all for taking a moment out of your day to listen to this critical information that was provided to you this evening. And Brother Basilis Barnes, again, thank you for the opportunity to participate. Outstanding work, the Brothers Theta Pi.
Thank you, Brother Dow. First, I know we're virtual, but I just have to give a big round of applause for our panelists. I am so appreciative of all of you. As Brother Dow stated, your candor and insights to these pressing matters were greatly appreciated. And I want to give my personal thanks to each of you. To Brother Walton and Brother Walker, thank you for leading the discussion. Great transitions, great questions. Thank you for keeping it moving. And, I appreciate you because I know you guys, but really appreciate you. I do want to recognize Brother James Moore. He's the kind of our subcommittee chair with this particular event for our Achievement Week, and his line brothers, the 2018 Theta Pi line, for taking this project. They did all of the hard work, all of the background in building it. I do want to give them a special thanks. So 2018, you did well. To the brothers of Theta Pi and all of the men of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, wherever you are, and who are joining us from not just California, but from around the world, big thank you for your support. And lastly, to the public who took the time out to join us and support this historic event, I want to share my thanks to all of you as well. Really, really appreciate it. This ends the program. Good night, everyone. Stay safe, and may God continue to bless each of you. And long live the Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. Good night.